Hi there, ladies and gentlemen. Hi there. It is Wednesday. It is time for the Reasonably Fine Art Talk, and I am so excited. Today, we're going to talk about the amazing Tom Thomson, who, to me, is sort of the artistic equivalent of the great blues master Robert Johnson, in that he just exploded like a supernova and then blinked out in a most elegantly mysterious fashion. And no one better to talk about Tom Thomson than the director of the McMichael Gallery in Kleinburg, Ontario, Mr. Ian Dejardin. I hope I pronounced that right. If I didn't, humor me.
I will.
But Ian has a slideshow. It's just going to be the briefest of overviews about Tom Thomson. But there's a longer lecture that he does that is on YouTube that I'm going to urge everybody to watch. That we'll flash the link to at the end. So now, without further ado, could we please welcome Mr. Ian Dejardin? Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here, I have to say. I mean, with all this technology, I doubted whether I'd make it, but here I am, large as life. And as you can hear, I'm Scottish. I'm from Edinburgh. So what am I doing in Canada? Taking Canadian art to the Canadians. Generally, I have to say, it's not just Tom Thomson, but I do feel that Canadian art is kind of underestimated, even in its own country. But outside it, nobody knows.
Well, it is interesting to me, though, that a couple of Thomson works are really kind of viewed as iconic by, it seems to me, most Canadians that I know. Now, of course, I mostly know artists and musicians, so kind of more aesthetics. I'm not really conversant with that many Canadian hockey players who may or may not know Tom Thomson. But the pieces that are iconic are these, are the Jack Pine and the West Wind. But the pieces that have always moved me the most are the series of plein air outdoor painting studies that he did up in the Algonquin Park in the last 3 years of his life. And that is what you mostly touch on in that Exploring Tom Thomson lecture that you do. But why don't you take us through, for those of us who don't know anything about him, why don't we put the slideshow up there and you just start taking us through, and I'll ask questions when...
I will. And here he is. I mean, this is the thing about Tom Thomson. He is iconic and legendary and all of those kind of words in Canada. He even has a mysterious death, as you've mentioned. We'll get to that in due course. So he has all of the makings of being, the ultimate kind of JFK, Marilyn Monroe figure in Canadian culture. And I mean, look at him. The extraordinary thing about him is that, he never became hugely famous. He was at the beginning of his career, really, when he died. He was 39 when he died. But nonetheless, the few photographs that survive of him, he always looks like he's understudying for Gary Cooper in a film. And I just, nobody seems to have been able to take a photo of him where he didn't look like he was starring in some sort of glamour film. And he often looks also like a kind of, an advertisement for Canadian clothing in a catalog. Yes. I mean,
that's remarkable. This photo, it does look like, well, here is our woodsman outfit for 1914. Yeah,
it's perfect. I mean, even the pipe. This, incidentally, my team at the McMichael refer to this hilariously as Tom Thomson and the Group of Seven, just because of the number of fish in it. But it makes a point, actually. The thing about Tom Thomson and the Group of Seven, who follow on from him and were friends of his. I mean, this is the great iconic group that really formed Canadian art. Is that it was all based on this kind of outdoorsy thing. They were engaging with Canada, needless to say, a very colonialist view of Canada, the wilderness, and they were trying to come up with a kind of brand Canada art form. They were trying to visualize it in a way that was modern and new and rejected the old Victorian stereotypes. And in order to do that, they felt they really had to get out there. And so they, it's all about, hiking boots and canoes and tents. And interestingly, this is what makes it fascinating to me, that whole business that you've already mentioned of the difference between this kind of finished exhibition paintings and the little sketches, which are about the size of an iPad. They're kind of 8 by 11, so 21 centimeters by 28 centimeters. Those little sketches come out of the fact that they're out there in the wild, because you couldn't take your whole studio with you. And what you did, you had a box. I mean, Tom Thomson made his own, and it survives. This quite small box, size of a computer, really, with slots in it, and you had these little pieces of wood that you painted on, and you used the bottom of the box as an easel, and you propped it up on your knee and you painted. And the thing is, that was all they could do, because they were out in the wild being bitten to death. I mean, I've been out there, and my God, the black flies, don't ever do it. You're bitten to death by bugs, and the weather changes in an instant, and you're suddenly drowning in rain or snow or sleet or whatever, or boiling in sun. And so the whole business of the oil sketch grows out of practicalities. And ironically, Thomson, just for some reason, a kind of perfect storm comes together. He was a not terrifically good commercial artist. He was okay. And that was how he made his money to begin with. He was in a commercial art firm, kind of doing posters and calling cards and that kind of thing. And he started as a Sunday painter about kind of 1912. He was already in his 30s,
Right. So born 1877 in Ontario, went to the States with his brother, or followed in the footsteps of his brother to an engraving firm in Seattle.
That's right.
Returned to Toronto, started doing this commercial work, imitating Charles Dana Gibson and others.
Yeah.
He was the best letterer at the firm, right?
That's right.
But then he somehow discovers Algonquin Park. How did he discover this place? Was this just their intellectual conversation of, we have to develop a Canadian art? There's some Canadian wilderness right up there.
Yes, I mean, it was partly the firm he was at. J.E.H. MacDonald was his great mentor, and MacDonald was one of the founding members of the Group of Seven. And he worked at Grip Limited, where Thomson was, and several others of the future Group of Seven were. And basically, the art director of that firm wanted them to engage with the Canadian landscape. And so they were encouraged to go out into the country and paint. Algonquin Park is thought of as this kind of great wilderness, but actually it was an industrial landscape in many ways. The timber industry had been through it like a dose of salts. And Algonquin Park was, one or two artists had been up there already. And Thomson went because an artist friend told him that was a good place for him to go. Mm-hmm. And that was in 1912. And then he went back every summer and spent as much time as he could.
Well, let's dive into the painting.
Carry on.
Talk about the good stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Enough with the fish. There you go. Now, this is kind of because his career is so absurdly short. As I say, he starts really as a Sunday painter in 1912, 1913, and he's okay, but he's a bit clunky. And because he was working in commercial art, he was very influenced by what was fashionable. And because Canada was about 20 years behind everybody else at that point, what was fashionable was still Art Nouveau. And you can see it in this gorgeous thing. I've reversed these in size, incidentally. The big one here is actually the sketch, because I do prefer the sketches generally. It's anathema to say so, but I'm surprised I haven't been.
Oh, not around here. Not around here. Here, good. This is a safe space for preferring the sketches.
Good. They won't exile me from the country yet. But the study is lovely, but you can see the line of it, that kind of sinuous line is there. This is a classic kind of Art Nouveau detail. But I do love the way
you're talking about that S shape.
Yes.
In this kind of the center.
Yes.
And yes, that people keep your eyes open for that. That does appear many times in Thomson's work.
It does. And
interrupted.
also that kind of screen, you know, that lovely kind of screen of trees. I mean, this is a consistent thing. He likes to kind of paint the view behind a screen of trees. And I mean, this is beautiful. The finished painting is very famous. I mean, there it is on the right. It's much bigger. And he tidies it up a bit, and the colors are still vibrant, but slightly different. But it's definitely the sketch that I love.
Right, and the sketch is gouache, it looks like.
Yes, it is.
It says graphite, brush, ink, and gouache on the illustration board. Yeah. So
Yeah.
the colors, the blues and reds in the foreground, on the left-hand foreground, that looks very gouache to me.
Absolutely. And he changes it rather in the finished painting. But in the next one, the next slide, if we can move on to that, this is the most famous painting in Canada, I think, probably. This is the Jack Pine. It's in the National Gallery of Canada in Ottawa. And I remember I asked for this when years ago, when I put together an exhibition. I was director of Dulwich Picture Gallery in London, which is a famous old master collection. But I varied the exhibition program as much as I could, and I put on this show called Painting Canada. And I asked for this, and I asked for the West Wind, which is other most famous painting from the Art Gallery of Ontario. Excuse me. And hung them together.
We may lose Ian here. He's just said very negative things about Tom Thomson's gallery, was his studio work, and apparently
absolutely.
Roof.
That's me. I'm being got at by the powers that be. But you can see they are. I mean, this is a big painting. And it's absolutely gorgeous. I haven't got the sketch here. The sketch is a kind of muddy little thing, but it's far more instantaneous.
Now this one, so there was a from life sketch that he worked from to develop this larger. Oh, okay.
Yes.
Was that true of all his work, or did he ever create anything out of the whole cloth?
What he does is, he goes to Algonquin Park and he paints an absolute storm of these little sketches. He would do perhaps 2 or 3 a day, I think. They take half an hour, something like that. Then he'd come back, hang them all around his kind of shack, which he worked in Toronto. And over the winter, when you can't do anything because it's too freezing anyway, he would paint and choose 1 or 2 of the sketches to feed into a finished painting. And he very often changed them radically. This is what fascinates me, is that very often the finished painting looks more, they're always beautiful, but they look more labored, more kind of consciously worked on than the sketches. And this is very true of the Jack Pine, but in the case of the Jack Pine, he really nailed it because the finished painting is gorgeous. He uses these slabs of color, which are not in the sketch. It's very swirly in the sketch. He translates that into these kind of, it's almost laid like bricks. The colors, very, very different. He changes the sky. He uses a different sketch for the night sky completely, and creates this absolutely iconic image, which just to Canadians, it's their Mona Lisa. Right. It's such a famous painting and so beautiful.
The fact that he's an avid fisherman meant that his first works were in places where he fished.
Yes, you are right, Liliane. You're absolutely right. And Thomson actually probably valued his ability as a fisherman almost more than as a painter. I mean, he was famous as a fisherman, and certainly the people in Algonquin Park, because it was pretty sparsely inhabited in those days. But his value was as a fisherman, and he earned some money as a guide and took people out fishing, and hence that wonderful photo of him standing there with his 7 fish. I mean, that's what he was proud of.
Right.
He very often gave the sketches away, Charlie. Can you believe it?
Really? Yeah. I have one of my friends from these music trains that we used to run. She lives in British Columbia, and she was a nurse in the health system out there, and one of her fellow nurses was Helen Chambers. That's her right there. Good morning from Vancouver. One of Helen's colleagues her family had a Tom Thomson sketch.
Oh,
No one took seriously because it was just kind of a family story, but then eventually did send it off and had it authenticated, and now it is in a collection.
well,
But
the problem was that people would just walk into his shack and say, "Oh, that's nice," and he would give them it. And eventually the artists, his artist friends, started mobilizing to try and stop him doing it because they could see the value of them. But he didn't. He handed them out, and this means, of course, that there are something like 650 of them known, but there are still sketches coming out of the woodwork, because people don't know they've got them, and they were handed out to their great aunt Maud because she liked it.
Isn't that's kind of wonderful, though? I mean, it rather than everything being labored and found and the mystery being gone, that it's still an evolving story.
And Diane's comment just there about the Scottish colorists, spot on, absolutely. He does remind me of the Scottish colorists indeed. And I think also the other area you should look is in Scandinavian art, because there's an awful lot of Norwegian artists around this time who are also searching for a kind of national visual language. And they were influential on the Canadians, I think, as well. So more kind of Scotland and the northern countries of Scandinavia, that's where you find the parallels, not so much in Paris.
Interesting. And
next slide.
Let's go to the next one, because we're going to get into the kind of more gestural stuff.
Here we go.
And that's where you just start looking at the sumptuousness of the brushwork. I mean, before we went live, ladies and gentlemen, we were joking that Tom Thomson was trying to write hit singles. He was like a musician who creates all this great music and then goes into the studio and tries to make a hit. And the Jack Pine indeed was a hit, and is a hit to this day. But in the work that he was doing 2 or 3 paintings a day when he was up in Algonquin, that is where the brushwork just smacks you across the head. It moves from being beautiful craft to being incredibly exciting 110 years later, to just watch the process of discovery, and the brushwork is still vitally exciting. So take it back away, Ian. I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that, you kind of ask yourself, where did this come from? Because by 1916, he's doing this, which is absolutely luminous. It's tiny. Again, it's 21 by 28 centimeters. And it just shines. And it's so assured and so brilliant, so fast. The control of color gives you a sense of the chill. It gives you the atmosphere, the temperature, the sense of being there. I always feel with Tom Thomson, you do actually feel like you're looking through his eyes. It's not like you're even looking over his shoulder. You're actually in there. And I find that astonishing because, as I said earlier, 1912, 3 or 4 years before that, he was painting. It was good, but it was kind of dull. And something happened, and it can only because he didn't travel and there wasn't anything really in Toronto for him to look at. I mean, he'd never seen anything by Van Gogh. He'd never seen anything by the French Impressionists. This is only through talking to other artists who had seen those things. So, I mean, here we are. This is Ontario's winter, just captured. And I have to say, the McMichael, it's an interesting place. It's a kind of huge log cabin in Kleinburg outside Toronto, and it sits in 100 acres of grounds. And the founder, Signe McMichael, she planted 5,000 trees in bare farmland to make the McMichael lands look like this. And in winter, believe me, they do. This is exactly what the McMichael looks like in winter. It's really wonderful.
And isn't at the McMichael, and we'll talk about the McMichael a little at the end, but isn't Tom Thomson's The Shack,
yes,
up there, his actual studio?
Absolutely. I mean, because there's a in Rosedale, which is a rather Tony area of Toronto to this day. Wealthy people live there, but Lauren Harris, who was to be a member of the Group of Seven and one of Canada's most famous artists, who also happened to be a millionaire, which I can recommend, Charlie, if you can pull it off. Being a millionaire is probably a good way of being an artist. But he built a studio building in Rosedale, and Tom Thomson, had a studio for about 20 minutes in 1914, but then couldn't afford it after that. And so Harris set up this old woodshed outside as a studio for Thomson, and he moved into that and shivered through the winters in that shack. In 1962, it was on the point of falling down, and Robert McMichael, our founder, bought it and literally took it down, shifted it to the McMichael. So it sits just outside the gallery, this beautiful old wooden building. And that's where he painted the Jack Pine and the West Wind. The West Wind was on his easel when he died. So anyway, we can move on to the next one if you like.
Yeah, let us. Next slide, please, Betty. Oh, this kills me. This kills me.
Well, I had to put this one in because this is in the McMichael's collection, I hasten to add, because it sums up everything I've been saying. Everything about the summer day this is painted on. The temperature, the sense of warmth in the air, everything about it is just perfect. And as a painter, I'm sure you've spotted how quickly that tent is sketched in and how he's used the underpaint. Basically you can still see the wood in the shadows that are cast on the tent there, and he's then filled them in with a bit of blue, right, really quickly.
Lily was saying that and I believe this is correct, that most of these works were done on shellacked cigar box tops.
Some of them were, yes. I mean, they were actually available. You could buy the little prepared panels. And I mean, Tom Thomson, was handy. I mean, basically, he would cut his own, I think, as well. Okay. But you could buy prepared ones too. But they would paint on anything they could afford, really.
The way the paint is applied on the tent itself is just he leaves the negative space of the ochre color is the shellacked wood surface, right? Or an underpainting.
That's right.
He's painting around the shape of the tent. He then puts the white down to define the tent, and then does he put the blue highlights in, or do you put the blue highlights in before he put the white down?
I think the blue goes in last. Okay. But what I find fascinating about this is that there's no drawing. He doesn't draw the tent at all. He doesn't outline it. And yet the whole structure is there just through leaving those little gaps and then filling in the odd bit of blue. It's amazing piece of painting. But you can see also, in the way he's painted the trees and the background, he's working with a quite big brush and working really fast.
Yeah, working really fast. I mean, most of our audience here are plein air painters. And so we all know how quickly the light shifts.
Yes.
So to the amount of time he had to get the play of light of the shadows across the tent is very, very limited, and he just nails it.
And I have to say that whole business of using the absence of paint positively in this way is one of the seminal lessons that Tom Thomson taught to the rest of Canadian artists. They all adopt that later on, and it becomes one of the signature motifs of Canadian art. The kind of sparkle around branches of trees, just left by the underpaint showing through. They all learned that lesson, and I'm not surprised because it is brilliant.
It works. It works beautifully, and it is reminiscent. And again, ladies and gentlemen, I really urge you to go to YouTube. We'll put the link up of this Exploring Tom Thomson lecture that Ian does that is an hour and a half long, because he also draws some really interesting parallels between kind of craft and the Thomson and the Group of Seven's paintings, including something I found really interesting on a couple of his Thomson's flower paintings. The background is black, and Ian contrasts that with a show that it's very possible Thomson had seen of First Nations beadwork that used a black background. So I think that nowadays in art, the world of art, quote unquote, or the world of painting, is very scared of interacting with the world of quote unquote craft. Whereas I feel less of that in Thomson's work. There's a jewel-like quality. The underpainting area is like the setting for the jewels of the paint in this, and it feels very unforced to me.
And now I'm very sorry I didn't include some of his flower paintings, because they are rather remarkable. And funnily enough, they remind me, again, I'm sorry for my British background, but they remind me of Bloomsbury, kind of Vanessa Bell, you know, that kind of consciously rough handling of paint. But they are very interesting, very beautiful. And you bear in mind that he is often looking, because he's a commercial artist, he is looking at the decorative as well. He's not scared of decorative in a way that, you know, that's become a dirty word.
Right.
Next.
And we did have a question about his palette. If you
yes.
Do you happen to know what his palette was?
Yeah, he does use a limited palette. I'm not, as a non-artist, I can't tell you really what it is. But I think that I discussed this with Dennis Reed many, many years ago, who was the kind of leading Canadian art scholar at that date. This is 10, 11 years ago. And he reckoned that actually Tom Thomson would set out with his painting box with no more than 4, 5, 6 tubes of color in the morning. You know, he would choose his tubes of color according to what the weather was, probably. And then he would stick to it. And if you actually spend the time to look at these sketches, more often than not, he will be only using a really limited number of colors, making the most of them. Usually about 5 at most, I think. And that's very different. Incidentally, that's very different from some of the group of 7. Someone like Franklin Carmichael will use 20 colors in a sketch. Thomson uses 5, and that's because he's out there.
Right, and ladies and gentlemen, those of you who remember our talk with C.W. Mundy a couple of months ago, he's now down to using 3.
There you go.
So, talk to us about this one.
Well, I included it because his nocturnes are some of the most remarkable things he ever did. There are stories of him. Clearly, he was very driven. I mean, you know, to have produced something like 650 of these amazing things in, you know, barely 5 years, and actually the best of them only within the last 2.5 to 3 years of his very shortened life. Nonetheless, there are stories of him rushing outside to capture the northern lights. You know, there would be northern lights appearing, and he was so reveling, I think, in his recently acquired skill. I mean, he must have been aware that suddenly he had this at his fingertips and he was able to capture anything. And it must have been tremendously exciting for him, I think. And so he was interested in some really difficult challenges. Northern Lights is part of it, but actually just nighttime scenes. Mm-hmm. He goes out and analyzes the monochrome that you get in moonlight and produces color equivalents for it. These are fantastic technical challenges. I mean, look at the sparkle on these birches, just from a little light blue. He kind of captures that sense of moonlight, and it goes throughout the bottom as well, that lovely khaki color. He's a quite remarkable colorist, and I feel like it's all instinctive. You know, he just somehow knew what color to use and didn't stop to think about it. It's just, I always feel, Charlie, I'm, as you've probably gathered, I'm an enthusiast. I think basically a fan is the word for me as an art historian. And it's the magicians that I respond to, the people who I look at and cannot get my head around how they've done it.
Right. Yep. Absolutely.
And that's Tom Thomson to me. I can look at these things and you can see the brushwork's quite crude and it's been done really fast and it's magic.
Yep. I'm 100% with you. Because I mean, and you know, this looks nothing like my work, but it absolutely resonates. And that's one of my great mentors was a American painter named Richard Schmid. And he said the beauty of art is that it lets you get to see what the world looks like through someone else's eyes. And seeing the way Thomson just cuts it down to sinew and bone in the foreground there, of basically the two colors of earth, the shadows being cast by the finger-like trees that are stitching the sky and the earth together with the no man's land of the water in between. I mean, it's an amazingly resonant painting. Amazing stuff.
And the other thing, I mean, next up, I mean, I've included one just to show snow. This is one of my favorites, actually, by him. I don't know why. I just particularly love it. And it's partly because, you know, there was all this talk at the time of the future group. You know, they were searching for this Canadian, it was a kind of nationalist thing. I mean, it's become unfortunate now because that tends to be seen as colonialist, but nonetheless, they were thinking of Canada as a young country and they wanted to capture it in a new way. And they tended to go the kind of Jack Pine route. You know, it was all about big skies and, you know, a pine tree. They were looking for the picturesque, but actually Tom Thomson's greatest lesson for them all was that, you know, stop on the path in the woods, turn to the left and paint what you see. And that's Canada. I mean, this is Canada, and yet it's just trees against a bank of snow. And what I love is that there's a line of kind of yellowish. It doesn't really reproduce perfectly, but that line of yellow behind, and then this gold in the sky. Again, he's captured that sense of chill in the air and the low sun coming through, and done it in incredible speed. And look at these little quadrangles of blue right at the center there, different from the kind of lilac, the rest of it. It's when you kind of look at things like that and think, what would it look like if you removed that color? And it wouldn't be the same. So there's magic in there. He's just chosen the right color somehow. I love this painting.
And it's amazing. He was self-taught, really didn't see the Impressionists.
No.
Right? It's amazing. It's amazing what he came up with. It's
No, I mean, we know that he was interested in Van Gogh, but he certainly never saw any. But the thing is that his friends, I mean, A.Y. Jackson and Lauren Harris and all of those people who become famous later, they had all trained in Europe. So they had all been there, so they can at least tell him about it. But, you know, this was 1912, you know, there were not great picture books. You could not bring, you know, you couldn't do it through Google Images. You were not going to see what Van Gogh actually painted like. The reproductions would be in black and white. So where is he getting it from? God knows. It's just a liberation, I think, for him. Post-Impressionism was just a liberation for him. I can use color, I can use brushstroke, and I can do what I like. And lo and behold, this is what he comes up with.
Amazing. And thank you for pointing out the differentiation of the blue, because that does, it ties to another image that we're going to see. But the way that everybody pay attention when Ian pay attention what Ian said about the purple, but then that kind of more aqua turquoise, those two passages in the center of the painting. But
he's using color as a focus. That's what it is. He's making your eye focus on something, and he's doing it instinctively. I find it amazing. Anyway,
yep.
Next. Now here's an Ontario sky. Mm-hmm. I now live on the 9th floor above High Park here in Toronto, and I look out and see this sky so often. It just means Ontario to me. I find it extraordinary. And again, almost the sky is glorious. Those three different blues and the clouds are, it's a wonderful exercise in cloud painting. But again, the miracle to me is that strip of green at the bottom, which tells you everything you need to know about that landscape on the other side of the lake. But he's used just, I think in many cases, the trees are just, he's turned the brush around and scraped with the wood into the paint. But you know, it's all there. I find that remarkable. This is again one of my favorite Tom Thomsons, because it gives you a whole world and a whole, you know, endless distance in this tiny thing the size of an iPad. I mean, what more could you ask for? Now I'm talking too much, but
no, you're doing great. You're doing great.
Thank you. Unless you've got any other questions, I think we could move on to the next one, because this is the one you were talking about coming up.
Yeah.
Now, I look at this thing. It's like a box of fireworks has gone off. Autumn woods, and I mean, it was quite an astonishing. It was one of the great discoveries moving to Canada. I had always assumed that all this nonsense that people talked about, fall color, you know, and this is true in Vermont as well, of course, was wildly exaggerated. And then, of course, when I moved here, it's not. Trees do go this color. But again, from the point your artist friend brought up, the limited palette, here it's, you know, it's the oranges and yellows, and there's a kind of muddy green in there, and there's the blue of the sky. But the point we were discussing earlier, Charlie, is in the middle there. Just in there, if you could see my cursor, I don't know if you can, there's a little splash of a kind of purpley, deep purpley blue. And it just appears in little dots.
Right. Betty Sue, can you go to the full? No. Oh, I can. Right.
There it is.
Yeah.
And, you know, the thing is, it's again, one of these questions. At first, you don't notice that. It's not playing a huge positive role in the painting. You know, it's all about the oranges and the reds and the yellows, of course. But if you took it away, somehow it wouldn't be the same painting. And of course, it's a complementary color, I suppose, in post-impressionist terms, you know. So you use blue to make a red or an orange ping more. But it's just, you can't believe he's spent a long time thinking, I must put in a bit of blue to make the reds sing. He hasn't thought about it. He's just done it.
Yeah. Yeah. And that is, remember, ladies and gentlemen, I say over and over again, you've got to put in the time. He put in the time doing painting after painting after painting, and then the magic started happening for him. And you know, another thing I really like that you point out in the Exploring Tom Thomson lecture is that he's not a graceful brushmeister. He's a stabber. He's, you know, that paint is that he's not messing around. He's putting it down in the limited amount of time that he's got.
That's right. You kind of expect there to be dead mosquitoes in there, you know, trapped in paint. I wouldn't be at all surprised. I always felt that Lucien Freud probably had a few dead bees in it as well. But certainly, you know, there'll be some black flies in there, I'm sure. That's my last actually painting of his. This is a very abbreviated sample, but I think I kind of chose things that I thought would say the most about what he achieved. But there, you know, I'm working on a Tom Thomson exhibition at the moment, actually, which we hope will come into fruition in kind of 2024, that sort of period. And so, you know, I'm spoilt for choice. But look at the man. I mean, honestly, he never took a bad photo. And frankly, you know, I'd buy that outfit right down to the moccasins. I mean,
the moccasins are amazing, because I was looking at them for getting that grip. They've got that flexible sole so that he can stand on top of the rock and have some purchase with his toes and the arch of his foot, because that's hazardous right there.
Hazardous. The interesting thing is that the photos that were taken of him. I'm sure this one, and certainly the one we saw at the beginning. I mean, if you noticed, we didn't comment on it, but the one right at the beginning with the 7 fish, you can see the shadow of the photographer falling on the right-hand side of that. There it is. There, look. Now, the thing is, you can tell who that is, I think, because of the shape of the head. There's only one man with that astonishing explosion of hair, and that's Lauren Harris, who looks kind of like an inverted toilet brush. Absolutely astonishing shock of white hair. And that, I think, is Lauren Harris. Now, that is significant because I think probably the fishing photograph is by Lauren Harris too. And of course, Lauren Harris is a great artist. So I think, you know, we've been fortunate that there are very few photographic portraits of Thomson, but they were taken by fellow artists usually, who cannot help but have an eye to a composition. I mean, here, you know, if you wanted a mysterious image of the loner, Thomson, the silent loner, which is what he came over as. He could be moody. He was very charming, but a moody, slightly distant character. Put him behind a fence like that, behind the fence. And then you've got this shadow on the right. You couldn't have, you know, you couldn't have created the photo. A modern art editor could not have created a more moody, more mysterious, more iconic image than this, or of the fishing Tom Thomson.
And that again is where I'm gonna draw the parallel between him and Robert Johnson, in that there are 2, possibly 3 extant photos of Johnson, and that's part of the myth, is just how haunted and possessed those images are. This is a unknowably mysterious photograph. It's just great. Betty Sue, could you put up the banners about the 2 things we need to talk about now? The McMichael itself. Tell us a little about what your vision for that museum is and what you are doing, and that you're going to be doing a Thomson show there.
Well, I mean, I'm very modest. I'm intent on global domination for Canadian art. The interesting thing about McMichael is that it is actually unique in Canada. It is it's a Crown agency. I mean, it's a provincial museum. It's the only museum in Canada whose mandate is entirely to do with the art of Canada. And there's no other that has that mandate. And so we take our role very seriously. We want to be a kind of center for the discussion of Canadian art. And one way we can do that is through, obviously, at the McMichael itself, which is an iconic building. I mean, it's a mad building. It's like a log cabin kind of sprung up overnight and just grew. It's just extraordinary. So it's kind of iconic Canadian in itself. And then it's in this wonderful landscape as well. So it represents Canada in a kind of visceral, architectural way. And then it has this wonderful collection inside where it sums up Canada. 1/3 of the collection is Indigenous. So, you know, we take that very seriously as well. We're on an the old Carrying Place Trail, which was the north-south trail in between Ontario and Georgian Bay. And so we have, this archaeological history there too. So we represent Canada in an absolute form. And one way in which we're doing this, my intent on global domination is led by our exhibitions, because we're the principal provider of Canadian content themed exhibitions in Canada. And currently, there are 5 at the moment that are on that we've curated from here. And over the next 2 years, there are 10 exhibitions touring across Canada.
So you do touring exhibitions as well?
Yes. No, we didn't used to. I mean, it's one of the things that I brought into being at the gallery. Now every exhibition we do is planned to tour, so that we can get out there, not just to Vancouver and Ottawa and Halifax, but to Kelowna and Kamloops and all of these extraordinary places, beginning with K, that there seem to be in Canada.
Right. I'm thinking of Rat Portage, right? Kenora. Kenora.
Kenora. Oh yes, we've got something opening in Kenora.
Good.
Absolutely. So that's our plan, is to get Canadian art out there, because as I said earlier, I'm shocked at how little valued it is, even in Canada. People tend not to value it as they should, I think. And I want the world to see Tom Thomson. The world deserves to see Tom Thomson.
I agree 100%. Now, Betty Sue, could you put up that the address of the YouTube of Exploring Tom Thomson lecture? I really urge you, ladies and gentlemen, you can just Google it if you don't write that down. Just go over to YouTube, and it's a McMichael presentation, and it's called Exploring Tom Thomson. It's an hour and a half long, and it is absolutely wonderful. And hopefully, Ian, I would love it if you'd consider later this year or next year or sometime coming back and doing another discussion with us about Emily Carr or the Group of Seven or whoever you would like.
Anytime. I've enjoyed it. It's been great.
This has been a joy. So thank you so much for doing it. Is there any of Thomson's work in the USA, Corey?
Not that I'm aware of. That I'm aware of. There are one or two in the UK by accident. I think by Canadians have taken them with them, but I've never found one in the USA. But I may be wrong. But I'm not aware of it.
But Tom Thomson is a very, very deep well, ladies and gentlemen, and you can do far worse than exploring it. So thanks so much, Ian. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you next week for one more reasonably fine art talk. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Bye.